He thought he was invincible because he wore a $5,000 suit and spoke a language he assumed she didn't understand. He sat at the best table, looked her up and down, and called her trash in the dialect of his grandfather. He expected her to blush, to apologize, to scurry away. Instead, she leaned in, smiled, and corrected his grammar. That was the exact moment the ruthless head of the Moretti family realized he was completely outmatched. The kitchen of Il Cavallo Bianco smelled of burning garlic, expensive truffles, and quiet desperation. It was a high-end establishment, the kind of place where men in bespoke suits paid $80 for a plate of pasta that cost $4 to make, just to impress women who were busy calculating the exit strategy of the date. Tessa stood by the stainless steel prep station. She pressed the heel of her hand against her lower back, trying to rub away a dull ache that had taken up permanent residence near her spine. Her black, non-slip shoes were giving out. The left sole was peeling away from the leather, currently held together by a thin strip of black electrical tape she'd applied in the employee locker room 3 hours ago. She needed new shoes. They cost $45 at the big box store across town, but $45 was also exactly the deficit she currently faced for her half of next month's rent. The shoes would have to wait. They always did. Table 7 needs their branzino, Tessa. Move. That was David, the floor manager, a man whose entire personality was built around kissing the rings of the wealthy patrons and screaming at the minimum wage staff. He was sweating through his cheap dress shirt. Chef still plating it. David, Tessa said. Her voice was flat. She didn't have the energy for inflection. It was hour 8 of a 10-hour double shift. She watched the expediter slide the heavy porcelain plates onto the heat lamps. She grabbed a tray, balanced the scalding dishes on her forearm, and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room. The transition from the kitchen to the floor was always jarring. It was a physical wall you hit. The kitchen was loud, bright hot, and frantic, full of curses in Spanish and English. The dining room was dim, cool, and suffocatingly quiet. Soft jazz played over hidden speakers. Crystal wine glasses clinked. The air conditioning was cranked so high it made the sweat on the back of Tessa's neck turn to ice. She walked over to table 7. She served from the left, cleared from the right. She poured the Pellegrino. She offered a rehearsed hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. The couple at the table didn't look at her. They didn't stop their conversation. The man merely shifted his arm so she could place the plate down, a gesture born of muscle memory rather than acknowledgement. To them, Tessa wasn't a person. She was a mechanism, a piece of furniture that delivered food. Tessa didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, she preferred it. When they didn't look at her, she didn't have to pretend she cared about their lives. She didn't have to pretend she wasn't mentally calculating whether she could afford generic brand laundry detergent, or if she'd have to wash her uniforms in the sink with dish soap again. She retreated to the wait station, tucking her tray under her arm. Jenna, another server, was leaning against the espresso machine, furiously texting on her phone. Jenna had red rims around her eyes. "Tips are garbage tonight," Jenna whispered without looking up. "Table 4 left me 5%. On a $300 check. I want to burn their cars." "It's a Tuesday," Tessa said, grabbing a polishing cloth and aggressively wiping down a stack of water glasses. "Rich people don't tip well on Tuesdays. They think we're lucky they showed up." Jenna let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I'm short on my car payment. If I don't pull at least $200 tonight, I'm taking the bus next week." Tessa kept wiping the glass. The glass squeaked. She knew the panic Jenna was feeling. It was a cold, heavy stone sitting at the bottom of the stomach. The math of poverty. It was exhausting. It demanded all your cognitive processing power, leaving nothing for dreams, hobbies, or personality. Just survival. Tessa wasn't supposed to be here. 3 years ago, she had been sitting in a sun-drenched classroom in Florence, dissecting the morphological differences between regional Italian dialects. She had a full scholarship. She had a future in linguistics. Then the phone call came. Her mother's diagnosis, the medical bills, the brutal, unforgiving reality of the American healthcare system. Tessa dropped out, flew back, and started waiting tables to keep the debt collectors from taking the house. Her mother passed away 6 months later anyway, leaving Tessa with nothing but a mountain of past due notices and an encyclopedic knowledge of a language she now only used to occasionally translate the menu for confused tourists. "David looks like he's going to have a stroke," Jenna murmured, nodding toward the front of the restaurant. Tessa looked up. David was standing by the heavy mahogany entrance doors. He wasn't just sweating now, he was pale. His hands were fluttering nervously around his waist. The low hum of the dining room seemed to dip. A ripple of tension moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. People stopped talking mid-sentence. Forks hovered over plates. "Oh God." Jenna breathed, her hands dropping from her phone. She took a step back, hiding herself slightly behind the espresso machine. "No, not tonight." "Who is it?" Tessa asked. "Moretti," Jenna said. The name tasted like ash. "Matteo Moretti." The door swung open, held wide by a man built like a cinder block. He scanned the room with a cold, mechanical efficiency, his eyes lingering on the blind spots, the exits, the spaces between the tables. Then Matteo Moretti walked in. He didn't burst through the doors. He didn't strut. He walked with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded absolute attention. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with unnatural perfection, the kind of tailoring that whispered of generational wealth and private backroom fittings. He was tall with sharp, angular features, a strong jawline, shadowed by a day's worth of stubble and dark hair, pushed carelessly back. He looked like old money. But the way he carried himself, the slight tension in his shoulders, the predatory stillness in his eyes, screamed violence. Tessa knew who the Morettis were. Everyone in the city did. You didn't have to watch the news to know who controlled the docks, who funneled money through the real estate high-rises, and who made local politicians sweat on debate stages. Matteo had taken over the family 2 years ago, after his father died, of a sudden, mysterious heart attack. Since then, the city had grown quieter, but the quiet was heavy. It was the silence of a choked scream. David practically sprinted to the front, bowing his head so low it was embarrassing. "Mr. Moretti, an absolute honor. We weren't expecting you, but of course your usual table is available." David's voice trembled. Matteo didn't look at him. He didn't even acknowledge David's existence. He just kept walking, moving past the hostess stand and directly into the main dining room. The cinder-block man followed a step behind him on his right. Another man, thinner, but wired with a nervous kinetic energy, flanked his left. They bypassed the front tables and headed straight for the large, semi-private booth in the back corner. The only problem was that a couple was already sitting there, midway through their appetizers. David scrambled after the men. "Sir, just give me 1 moment. I will clear the table." Matteo stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked down at the couple. The man in the booth, a wealthy executive type who normally barked at waiters for sport, looked up. The executive's face drained of color. He looked from Matteo to the cinder-block man, then down at his half-eaten calamari. Matteo didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The executive grabbed his napkin, wiped his mouth frantically, and stood up. "We were just leaving," he mumbled, practically pulling his date out of the booth. They abandoned their food, their coats, and half a bottle of Barolo, scurrying toward the front door without looking back. Matteo slid into the leather booth. His men took the seats opposite him. Back at the wait station, Jenna was shaking her head violently. "I'm not doing it! I am not serving that table!" "It's your section, Jen," Tessa pointed out quietly. "I don't care. Last time, he came in, one of his guys grabbed Maria by the wrist and left a bruise because she brought the wrong vintage. David fired Maria the next day to keep them happy. I'm not going over there. I will quit right now. I swear to God." Jenna was hyperventilating, her chest heaving under her starched white shirt. David came rushing into the wait station. He looked panicked, his eyes darting frantically. "Jenna, get over there. Water, no ice lemon on the side. Bring the reserve wine list. Now." "I can't." Jenna choked out, tears actually pooling in her eyes. "David, please, don't make me." David's face darkened, the panic morphing into cruelty. "You go over there, or you don't bother coming in tomorrow." Jenna let out a sob, freezing in place. She couldn't afford to be fired, but she was paralyzed by genuine terror. Tessa looked at Jenna. She looked at the tears spilling over the girl's mascara. Then she looked down at her own taped-up shoe. The rent was due. The electricity bill had a final notice printed on pink paper sitting on her kitchen counter. Rich, dangerous men who cleared tables with a look were exactly the kind of men who threw $100 bills down without looking at the total. "I'll take it," Tessa said. David stopped. He looked at Tessa. "I'll take the table. Give me the check. I get the tip." David didn't care who took the table as long as the men got served and didn't burn the restaurant to the ground. "Fine. Fix your apron. Go. Do not look him in the eye unless he addresses you. Do not interrupt him." Tessa didn't bother fixing her apron. She grabbed 3 heavy crystal water goblets, a silver pitcher of iced water, and a small plate of lemon wedges. She didn't feel fear. You needed a surplus of energy to feel fear. Tessa was just tired. She walked across the dining room floor. As she approached table 4, the temperature seemed to drop. The 3 men were seated in silence. The thin, wiry man was tapping his fingers on the table. The cinderblock man was staring straight ahead. Matteo was leaning back against the leather upholstery, slowly rotating a heavy silver lighter between his fingers. He pulled a cigarette from an inner pocket and placed it between his lips. Smoking indoors had been illegal in the city for 15 years. Tessa watched as he flicked the lighter. A flame flared. He inhaled deeply, the tip of the cigarette glowing bright orange. He blew a stream of pale blue smoke directly up toward the expensive chandelier. Nobody in the restaurant moved to stop him. Nobody said a word. Tessa stepped up to the table. Tessa moved with practiced efficiency. She didn't hesitate. She placed the crystal goblets down, 1, 2, 3. She picked up the silver pitcher and began pouring. She didn't let the lip of the pitcher touch the glass. She didn't spill a drop. Matteo didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the thin, wiry man across from him. "I told you to handle the shipment at the eastern port," Matteo said. His voice was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of warmth. The wiry man shifted uncomfortably. "We tried, boss. The union rep is holding out. He wants a bigger cut. Says the risk is higher now." Matteo took another drag of his cigarette. "He doesn't dictate the risk. I do. Tell him he takes what we offer, or we put someone in his chair who knows how to say thank you." Tessa finished pouring the water. She set the small dish of lemons in the center of the table. "Would you gentlemen care to see the reserve wine list? Or can I start you with something from the bar?" she asked. Her voice was steady, polite, but completely neutral. Matteo slowly turned his head. He looked at her. It wasn't a glance. It was an appraisal. He looked at her worn uniform, the slight fraying at the collar of her shirt, the dark circles under her eyes. His gaze was heavy, invasive, and entirely dismissive. He looked at her the way a man looks at a smudge on a window before demanding someone else clean it. He didn't answer her. Instead, he turned his attention back to his men. He switched languages. He began speaking in Italian, not the melodic textbook Italian taught in universities. It was a harsh, clipped regional dialect, Neapolitan, laced with street slang and heavy vowels. He assumed he was surrounded by a wall of impenetrable sound. He assumed the tired, pale waitstaff in this overpriced American restaurant only knew how to say grazie and prego. "Guarda questa," Matteo said, gesturing vaguely in Tessa's direction without looking at her. "Look at this one." The wiry man snickered. The cinderblock man remained stoic. Tessa stood perfectly still. Her face remained a mask of professional courtesy. Sembra che non dorma da un mese. Probabilmente troppo stupida per trovare un lavoro vero. Matteo continued taking a drag of his cigarette. Looks like she hasn't slept in a month. Probably too stupid to find a real job. Tessa's grip on the silver water pitcher tightened just a fraction. The metal dug into her palm. She breathed in the smell of his cigarette smoke, mixed with expensive cologne. Portami del cibo vero, non questa merda nel menù. Matteo ordered his men, waving his hand over the leather-bound menu on the table. Bring me real food, not this shit on the menu. Then he looked directly at Tessa. He gave a sharp, arrogant whistle, the kind you'd use to call a stray dog. He pointed a finger at her. Ehi, sciacquetta, he barked. Hey, trash. Voglio una bistecca, cotta al sangue, e dille di muoversi prima che mi incazzo. Speriamo che non inciampa sui suoi stessi piedi. I want a steak, rare, and tell her to move before I get pissed. Let's hope she doesn't trip over her own feet. The wiry man translated a smirk playing on his lips. The boss wants a steak, rare, not the garbage on your menu. A real cut, and bring it fast. Tessa didn't acknowledge the wiry man. She didn't write anything down on her notepad. She stood at the edge of the table, holding the pitcher, the weight of her exhaustion suddenly burning away, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at Matteo, really looked at him. She saw the expensive suit, the custom watch, the absolute certainty of his own superiority. She hated men like him. Men who broke the world and made people like her sweep up the glass. Tessa set the heavy silver water pitcher down on the table. It made a solid, echoing thud over the wood. The wiry man flinched. Matteo's eyes narrowed slightly. Tessa looked dead into Matteo's dark eyes. She didn't break contact. She let a slow, perfectly polite smile spread across her face. Sciacquetta è un termine un po' datato, non trova? Tessa said. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was a sudden vacuum of sound. The wiry man's mouth dropped open. The cinderblock man shifted his massive weight, his hand instinctively dropping toward his jacket. Matteo froze. The cigarette halted halfway to his lips. Tessa's voice was smooth, resonant, and dripping with flawless aristocratic Florentine diction, the kind of Italian spoken by academics and nobility. It made Matteo's rough street dialect sound like mud next to polished glass. Trash is a somewhat dated term, don't you think? She didn't stop. She kept her eyes locked on his, her smile unwavering, weaponizing the very language he had tried to hide behind. Inoltre, Tessa continued her tone conversational, but sharp as a scalpel. Se vuole insultarmi correttamente, usando la grammatica adeguata, dovrebbe usare il congiuntivo per esprimere speranza o dubbio. Non è speriamo che non inciampa, è speriamo che non inciampi. Furthermore, if you want to insult me correctly, using proper grammar, you should use the subjunctive mood to express hope or doubt. It is not, let's hope she doesn't trip. It is, let's hope she doesn't trip. Inciampi, subjunctive. The wiry man let out a choked, terrified noise at the back of his throat. He looked at Matteo as if waiting for the room to explode. Matteo slowly lowered his cigarette. He placed it carefully into the crystal ashtray. His eyes, which moments before had been bored and dead, were now entirely focused on her. They were dark, dangerous, and suddenly blazing with a shocking intensity. Tessa picked up her water pitcher. She smoothed her apron with her free hand. Una bistecca al sangue. Subito, signore, she concluded smoothly. A rare steak. Right away, sir. And just so you know, our shit menu features a prime, dry-aged ribeye that will likely be the best thing you put in your mouth all year. I'll put the order in. She didn't wait to be dismissed. She turned on her taped-up heel and walked away. Behind her, the table remained dead silent. She felt the heavy burning weight of Matteo Moretti's stare tracking her all the way across the dining room, burning a hole straight through her spine. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The noise hit her like a wave. The heat wrapped around her. She walked over to the POS system, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline dump of finally, for once, in her miserable 3 years of service work, biting back. She punched in the order for the ribeye. "Hey!" David hissed, appearing at her elbow. His face was slick with sweat. "What happened? Are they okay? Why did he stop smoking? Did you say something?" Tessa ripped the printed ticket from the machine and slammed it onto the metal pass. "They're fine, David," Tessa said, her voice dropping back into its flat, exhausted monotone. Just a minor disagreement over syntax. Out in the dining room, Matteo Moretti leaned back in his booth. He didn't pick his cigarette back up. He rested his elbows on the table, staring at the swinging kitchen doors. "Boss," the wiry man whispered, terrified. "Do you want me to get the manager? We can have her fired. We can—" Matteo held up a single hand. The wiry man snapped his mouth shut instantly. Matteo kept staring at the doors. A slow, incredibly dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "No," Matteo said quietly. "Nobody gets her fired." He reached for his glass of water, took a sip, and didn't take his eyes off the kitchen. "Leave her exactly where she is." The dry-aged ribeye hissed on the ceramic plate, a thick slab of violently seared meat resting in a pool of dark, fragrant au jus. The smell of roasted marrow and burnt rosemary cut through the sterile kitchen air. Tessa wiped the rim of the plate with a clean towel. She hoisted the heavy tray onto her shoulder. Her lower back gave a sharp, warning throb. She ignored it. She pushed through the swinging doors and walked back into the ice-cold dining room. Table 4 had not moved. The wiry man was sweating lightly, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds. The large man sat perfectly still, a human boulder in a custom suit. Matteo was waiting. He tracked her approach. He didn't look at her legs or her waist, the way most men in this restaurant did when they thought the waitstaff couldn't see. He looked at her face. He studied her micro-expressions, the set of her jaw, the relaxed slope of her shoulders, the absolute lack of deference in her eyes. Tessa arrived at the table. She served from the left. She placed the steak directly in front of him. "Dry-aged ribeye. Rare," Tessa said smoothly. She didn't use Italian this time. The point had already been made. "Care for cracked pepper, or is the chef's seasoning sufficient?" Matteo looked down at the plate. The crust was charred dark brown, the center a deep bloody red. It was exactly what he had demanded. He picked up his steak knife. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Your accent," Matteo said. His English was flawless. It lacked the heavy guttural weight of his Italian, replaced instead by a smooth baritone rhythm. "It's Florentine. But your cadence is too sharp. You didn't grow up there. You learned it in a classroom." Tessa paused. She held the pepper mill in both hands. She could have walked away. She should have walked away. David was watching from the host stand, his face pale with anxiety. "I studied at the Università degli Studi di Firenze," Tessa replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "For 3 years. Applied linguistics." Matteo cut into the steak. The knife slid through the meat like butter. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "And yet," Matteo said finally, looking up at her, "you are here, wearing a polyester shirt and carrying water for men who call you trash. Why?" The bluntness of the question felt like a physical shove. People didn't ask why in polite society. They asked, "How are you?" and ignored the answer. "Life is full of unexpected detours, Mr. Moretti," Tessa said. Her tone was polite, but it held a definitive edge, a steel door closing. "If the steak is to your liking, I'll leave you to your meal." "I didn't dismiss you," he stated quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple factual observation of the power dynamic. He was the patron. She was the server. He was the apex predator of the city. She was a girl with tape on her shoe. Tessa didn't flinch. She met his gaze. "My section has 4 other tables, sir. 2 of them need their checks, and 1 is waiting on a bottle of Chianti. I am paid to serve the room, not to provide biographical entertainment." The wiry man across the table choked on his water. He slammed his glass down, coughing into his napkin, his eyes wide with horror at her sheer audacity. Matteo stared at her. The silence stretched. The low jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers suddenly felt incredibly loud. Tessa felt the familiar spike of adrenaline, the cold sweat prickling at her hairline. She had pushed it. She knew she had pushed it. Then the corner of Matteo's mouth twitched. A fraction of an inch. "Go serve your Chianti, Tessa," he said softly. He had read her name tag. He hadn't called her a waitstaff pejorative. He used her name, and the way he said it, rolling the double S, slightly made the hair on her arms stand up. She turned and walked away. For the next 45 minutes, she avoided table 4. She sent Jenna over to refill their water. Jenna returned to the wait station, hyperventilating, claiming Matteo hadn't even blinked when she filled the glasses. When the men finally stood to leave the dining room, seemed to collectively exhale. Matteo buttoned his suit jacket. He didn't look back toward the wait station. He simply walked out the front doors, his men trailing behind him, parting the sea of wealthy diners like Moses at the Red Sea. Tessa waited a full 2 minutes before walking over to clear the table. The steak plate was completely clean. The water glasses were empty. Sitting in the center of the dark mahogany table, directly under the warm glow of the pendant light, was the leather checkbook. Tessa picked it up. She opened the flap. The bill was $240. Sitting on top of the receipt was a neat, folded stack of $100 bills. Tessa's breath hitched. She didn't want to count it. She knew instantly it was too thick. Her hands, which hadn't shaken when correcting a mob boss in his own language, trembled as she flipped through the crisp, uncirculated bills. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. $5,000. There was no note, no phone number scrawled on a napkin, just a heavy, silent stack of legal tender. "Give it to me." David's hand darted out, trying to snatch the stack of bills from Tessa's fingers. They were standing in the small, cramped manager's office in the back of the kitchen. The smell of bleach and old fryer oil was suffocating. Tessa yanked her hand back, shoving the money deep into the pocket of her black apron. "It's my tip, David," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "It's a mistake," David hissed, his forehead gleaming with sweat. "Or it's dirty money. You think Matteo Moretti just leaves $5,000 on a $200 check out of the goodness of his heart? Men like that don't do charity. They buy things. They buy favors. I am putting it in the safe. If it's a mistake, he can come back and ask for it," Tessa said, her voice hard. "And if he doesn't, it's mine. Read the labor laws, David. You touch a server's cash tip, I'll call the labor board so fast your head will spin." David sneered. "You think the labor board cares about mafia money? You're going to get this restaurant burned to the ground because you want to play tough." "I served the table. I took the risk. I keep the cash." Tessa turned and walked out of the office. She went straight to the employee locker room, stripped off her apron, and changed into her street clothes. Her hands were still shaking. $5,000. It was a ridiculous amount of money. To the people dining in the front room, it was a weekend trip to Aspen. To Tessa, it was oxygen. It was 3 months of rent. It was the overdue electricity bill. It was groceries that didn't come in a cardboard box. It was quite literally survival. She walked out the back door of the restaurant into the alley. The cold night air hit her lungs like broken glass. It was raining a fine, freezing mist that instantly soaked through her thin denim jacket. She walked quickly. She didn't take the bus. She didn't want to sit in an enclosed space with a small fortune sitting in her pocket. Every shadow in the alleyway looked like a man in a custom suit. Every passing car sounded like a threat. The psychological weight of the money was crushing. David was a coward, but he wasn't wrong. Men like Matteo Moretti didn't give away money for nothing. The tip wasn't a reward for good service. It was a collar. It was him saying, "I have so much power that I can change your entire life with the change in my pocket." She stopped at an ATM inside a brightly lit 24-hour convenience store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass barely looked up from his phone. Tessa fed the bills into the machine. One by one. The machine whirred and clicked, swallowing the crisp hundreds. With every bill accepted, the heavy stone in her chest lightened just a fraction. New balance, $5,012.45. She stared at the screen. She hadn't seen a comma in her bank account since before her mother got sick. A hot, unexpected tear tracked down her cold cheek. She wiped it away viciously. The next morning before her shift, Tessa went to the big box store. She walked down the sterile, brightly lit aisles. She found the shoe department. She picked up a pair of black, non-slip work shoes. $45. They were ugly, heavy, and purely functional. She didn't look at the price tag with a sense of dread. She just put them in her basket. She threw her old shoes in a public trash can outside the store. The electrical tape had finally given out entirely. When she walked into Il Cavallo Bianco that afternoon, her feet didn't ache. The new rubber soles squeaked sharply against the tiled floor of the kitchen. David glared at her from across the pass, but said nothing. Jenna looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. "Did he really leave $5,000? Jenna whispered, as they rolled silverware in the back station. "Yes," Tessa said flatly. "Are you going to keep it?" "It's already spent." Jenna stared at her. "Tessa, you're insane. He's going to come back." "Let him," Tessa said, snapping a paper band around a bundle of forks. "What's he going to do? Ask for a refund?" But deep down, beneath the bravado and the comfort of her new shoes, Tessa knew Jenna was right. Matteo Moretti wasn't a man who walked away from a puzzle he hadn't solved. He made her wait 4 days. It was a Friday night. The restaurant was completely slammed. A chaotic symphony of clinking silverware, raised voices, and the frantic ringing of the kitchen bell. Tessa was running 3 large tables at once, balancing a tray of dirty martini glasses, while mentally calculating the cook time on a sea bass. She turned the corner near the host stand and stopped dead. He was sitting at a small 2-top table near the window. Table 12, her section. He didn't have the cinder block man with him. The wiry man was nowhere to be seen. Matteo was alone. He was wearing a dark navy suit tonight, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. He looked less like a mafia boss, holding court, and more like a wealthy, bored insomniac. David was hovering near the table, wringing his hands. Matteo was ignoring him, looking out the rain-streaked window at the passing city traffic. Tessa took a deep breath. She adjusted her tray, dropped the dirty glasses at the bar, and walked over to table 12. The squeak of her new rubber shoes announced her arrival. Matteo turned his head. His dark eyes flicked downward, resting on her feet for exactly 1 second. He noticed. He noticed the lack of tape. He noticed the new, stiff leather. He looked back up at her face. A slow, subtle smirk ghosted across his lips. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti," Tessa said. Her voice was steady. "Just you tonight." "Just me. Would you like to see a menu or espresso?" Matteo interrupted smoothly. "Black. And whatever dessert the chef hasn't ruined. Tiramisu, it's passable," Tessa said. "Bring it." She walked to the espresso machine. Jenna was hiding by the dish pit, shaking her head. Tessa ignored her. She pulled a perfect shot of espresso, the dark crema, rich and thick. She plated a square of tiramisu, dusting it with bitter cocoa powder. When she returned to the table, Matteo had placed a sleek black phone face down on the wood. He watched her set the cup and plate down. "Sit," Matteo said. Tessa froze. "Excuse me." "Sit down, Tessa." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "I'm working. I have tables." Matteo didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I bought your time on Tuesday. $5,000 covers a 15-minute coffee break. Sit." The logic was infuriatingly sound, wrapped in a layer of absolute arrogance. Tessa looked around. David was watching from the corner, his eyes wide, furiously nodding at her to do whatever the man wanted. Tessa pulled out the heavy wooden chair and sat down. She kept her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap. Matteo took a sip of his espresso. He didn't break eye contact. "My grandfather came from Naples." Matteo began, his voice low, conversational. "He came here with nothing. He built an empire. He spoke that dialect you corrected me on. It was the language of the docks of the street. It was the language of survival. It's a beautiful dialect," Tessa said quietly. "Rich in history, but your conjugation was still wrong." Matteo let out a short, genuine laugh. It was a deep, gravelly sound that completely transformed his face, stripping away the cold predator and revealing something startlingly human. "You don't back down," he observed. "I don't have the luxury of backing down, Mr. Moretti." "Matteo." "Mr. Moretti," Tessa repeated, refusing the familiarity. "You left a ridiculous amount of money on my table. If you expect a thank you, consider this it. If you expect me to act like I owe you something, you're going to be disappointed." Matteo leaned forward. The amusement faded from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, probing intensity. "I don't buy gratitude. It's cheap," he said softly. "I left that money because I wanted to see what you would do with it." "I bought shoes," Tessa said bluntly. Matteo's eyes flicked to the floor again. "I noticed. And the other $4,955, rent, electricity, debt." Matteo studied her. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes that hadn't completely faded the tense set of her jaw. He was a man who spent his life analyzing weaknesses, finding the cracks in people's armor, and exploiting them. "You're drowning," Matteo said. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. "I'm swimming," Tessa corrected fiercely. "I'm just in a very deep pool." "Linguistics," he murmured, changing the subject with whiplash speed. "You went to Florence. You had a scholarship. Then 3 years ago you vanished from the academic registry. You came back to this city and started carrying plates." Tessa's blood ran cold. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. "You investigated me," she whispered. "I am careful," Matteo said simply. "A waitress in a mediocre restaurant speaks flawless high society Italian and doesn't flinch when my men are sitting at the table. Of course I looked into you, Tessa. You have no right. I have the means. Rights are irrelevant." Matteo pushed the tiramisu plate away. He hadn't touched it. "Your mother died. Medical debt." Tessa stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Several diners turned to look. She didn't care. The exhaustion that usually weighed her down was entirely burned away by a sudden, blinding flash of pure anger. "My break is over," Tessa said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. She turned to walk away. Matteo moved with terrifying speed. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was an iron clamp. Unmovable. Tessa gasped, looking down at his large hand locked around her thin wrist. Matteo looked up at her. The air between them crackled with a sudden heavy tension. It was the first time they had touched. His skin was warm, his thumb resting directly over her racing pulse. "Don't run away when I'm speaking to you," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. "Let go of me," Tessa said. She didn't pull away. She just stared at his hand. "Or I will scream, and David will call the police, and you will have to explain to the city why the great Matteo Moretti is assaulting waitstaff in public." Matteo looked at her defiant face. He felt the frantic bird-like flutter of her pulse beneath his thumb. She was terrified, but she was entirely willing to burn the room down rather than submit. Slowly, deliberately, Matteo opened his fingers. He released her wrist. Tessa immediately stepped back, rubbing her arm, though it didn't hurt. Matteo stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket. He looked taller, standing this close to her. Imposing. Entirely in control. "I have a proposition for you, Tessa," Matteo said, quietly stepping into her space, so only she could hear him over the din of the restaurant. "I'm not interested. You haven't heard it yet. I don't care. I don't work for you. I don't want your money. I want you to pay for your coffee and leave." Matteo reached into his inner pocket. Tessa tensed, bracing herself. Instead of a weapon, he pulled out a crisp white business card. He placed it on the table next to the empty espresso cup. "I do business with men who speak Russian, Mandarin, and Sicilian," Matteo said. "I need an interpreter. Someone who understands nuance. Someone who isn't afraid of the men in the room. Someone who corrects the grammar of a threat." Tessa stared at the card. It was embossed with a single M. "I'm a waitress." "You're a linguist who was forced to be a waitress," Matteo corrected. "And you are currently wasting your life serving cold fish to men who treat you like furniture." He stepped past her, moving toward the front exit. He paused, turning back slightly. "10,000 a week. Cash. You only work when I need you." Matteo didn't wait for an answer. He walked out into the rain, leaving Tessa standing alone in the middle of the crowded dining room, staring at the white card on the table as if it were a live grenade. The business card sat on Tessa's chipped Formica kitchen counter for 3 days. It sat there while she boiled off-brand pasta for dinner. It sat there while she carefully glued a broken coffee mug back together. It sat there while she opened a letter from a debt collection agency, the red ink glaring at her under the flickering fluorescent kitchen light. $10,000 a week. It was a trap. She knew exactly how men like Matteo operated. They didn't hire employees, they acquired assets. They bought your loyalty, your silence, and eventually your soul. But as she stared at the overdue medical bills that still bore her dead mother's name, the cold, cynical math of survival overrode her moral preservation. She needed to breathe. Just for a little while. On Thursday morning, she picked up her phone and dialed the number. A man answered on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He just gave her an address and a time. 2 hours later, Tessa stepped out of a cab in front of a sleek, glass-fronted high-rise in the financial district. It wasn't a smoky back room or a dimly lit warehouse. It was corporate terrain, the kind of place where billions of dollars moved invisibly through the air. Frank, the cinderblock man from the restaurant, was waiting for her in the marble lobby. He didn't smile. He just nodded and pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner on the private elevator. 42nd floor, Frank said, his voice sounding like rocks grinding in a cement mixer. "Boss says you listen first. Speak only when he tells you to." Tessa nodded. Her mouth was dry. She was wearing her best clothes, a simple black turtleneck and a grey wool skirt, but she felt entirely exposed. The elevator doors parted, revealing a sprawling, minimalist boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. A heavy oak table dominated the space. Matteo sat at the head of the table. He wore a grey suit today, his posture relaxed but commanding. Across from him sat 3 men. They were older, impeccably dressed, radiating the smug, untouchable aura of European generational wealth. Matteo glanced at Tessa as she entered. He didn't smile, but a subtle shift in his shoulders betrayed a fraction of tension leaving his body. He gestured to the empty leather chair to his right. Tessa walked over and sat down, The chair was absurdly comfortable. "Gentlemen," Matteo said, switching to English. "This is my associate. She will be assisting us today." The man in the center across the table, a silver-haired man with a deeply lined face and a bespoke silk tie, looked at Tessa with open amusement. An associate, the silver-haired man said, his accent heavily steeped in the Swiss-Italian borderlands of Ticino. "Matteo, we are discussing the restructuring of 70 million euros through Geneva. We do not need a secretary taking notes." "She isn't a secretary, Rossi," Matteo replied smoothly. "She is here to ensure our mutual understanding is perfectly clear. Proceed." The men from Ticino exchanged a look. Then they switched completely to their native dialect. It was a rapid, clipped variation of Lombard Italian, laced with obscure financial terminology and regional slang designed specifically to keep outsiders in the dark. For the next 20 minutes, Tessa sat perfectly still. She listened. The Swiss bankers spoke of interest rates, offshore routing, and a newly proposed administrative fee for handling Matteo's incoming shipments through their holding companies. Matteo's current interpreter, a nervous-looking man sitting at the far end of the table, was sweating. He was translating the broad strokes into English for Matteo. "They say the routing requires a new 7% holding fee due to increased federal scrutiny in the banking sector," the nervous interpreter stammered. Rossi smiled, a thin reptilian stretching of his lips. He leaned back, sipping sparkling water. Matteo tapped a gold pen against the table. He looked at Tessa. "Tessa," Matteo said quietly. "Is that what they said?" Tessa looked at the nervous interpreter. He was translating the words literally, but he was entirely missing the syntax of the deception. She turned her gaze to Rossi. "No," Tessa said, her voice clear and carrying effortlessly across the large room. Rossi's smile vanished. The other two bankers stiffened. "They didn't use the term for federal scrutiny," Tessa continued, looking directly into Rossi's eyes. "The specific Lombard slang they used translates closer to internal hemorrhage. They aren't worried about the government, Matteo. They are bleeding capital from a bad investment somewhere else. The 7% isn't an administrative fee to protect your money. It's a tax to plug a hole in their own sinking ship." Dead silence fell over the boardroom. The nervous interpreter paled. Rossi slammed his water glass down onto the table. "Come si ragazzina stupida," Rossi snarled, abandoning the polite facade. "How dare you, stupid girl? You know nothing of our operations." Tessa didn't flinch. The adrenaline that usually terrified her was suddenly cold and focusing. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the heavy oak table. "Ho sentito le pause nel suo discorso," Tessa replied, her Florentine Italian cutting through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "I heard the pauses in your speech. Usa il condizionale quando parla di garanzie, ma l'imperativo quando parla delle commissioni di Matteo. Non è una negoziazione, è un'estorsione travestita da favore. You use the conditional tense when speaking of guarantees, but the imperative when speaking of Matteo's fees. It is not a negotiation. It is extortion disguised as a favor." Rossi's face mottled with rage. He looked at Matteo, pointing a trembling finger at Tessa. "You bring this arrogant child to insult me. We manage your family's money. We wash the blood off your hands." Matteo didn't look at Rossi. He didn't even blink. He kept his eyes entirely on Tessa. A dark, visceral hunger flashed in his gaze, a deep, profound satisfaction at watching her dismantle a room full of powerful men with nothing but grammar and intellect. Matteo slowly stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. "The deal is dead," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Rossi panicked. "Matteo, be reasonable. We can negotiate the percentage." "I don't negotiate with men who steal from me and smile while they do it," Matteo interrupted. He looked down at the three bankers. "You have until the end of the month to transfer all my existing capital out of Geneva and into the accounts my associate will provide you. If you are short by a single euro, I won't send lawyers to Switzerland. I will send Frank. Frank, standing by the door, offered a terrifyingly blank smile. The bankers scrambled up, gathering their briefcases with shaking hands. They didn't say another word as they hurried out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind them. The silence rushed back in. Tessa exhaled. Her hands were shaking. She hid them under the table. She had just blown up a multi-million-dollar money-laundering pipeline for the biggest crime syndicate in the city. Matteo walked around the table. He stopped right beside her chair. He looked down at her. "Internal hemorrhage," Matteo murmured. "It was in the prefix they used," Tessa said, keeping her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. A subtle modification, usually meant to imply a domestic dispute or a family failing. They were covering their own losses. Matteo reached out. His hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before his knuckles gently brushed against the side of her face, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly soft, a shocking contrast to the violence he commanded. "You just saved me $3 million, Tessa." She looked up at him. "Do I get a commission?" Matteo laughed. It was that genuine gravelly sound again. 10,000 a week, not a penny more. I have a budget to maintain. Then I expect a very good lunch," she said. Done. It was raining again. The city seemed perpetually soaked in it. Tessa sat in the passenger seat of Matteo's armored SUV. The heavy bullet-resistant glass warped the streetlights into blurred streaks of neon yellow and red. The interior smelled of rich leather and the faint, lingering scent of Matteo's aftershave. He was driving. No chauffeur. Just the two of them, insulated from the cold, wet world outside. It had been 4 weeks since the boardroom. 4 weeks of private meetings, translating decrypted emails and listening to audio intercepts. She was making more money in a week than she used to make in 6 months at the restaurant. Her rent was paid a year in advance. The medical debts were gone. Yet she hadn't quit Il Cavallo Bianco. She still worked 3 shifts a week. Matteo pulled up to a red light. The windshield wipers beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "Why do you still go there?" Matteo asked quietly. He didn't look at her. He watched the intersection. "You don't need the money. You don't need the abuse from that sweating manager." Tessa leaned her head against the cool glass. "It keeps me grounded. It keeps you exhausted. It reminds me of what happens if I rely entirely on someone else," she corrected softly. "If I quit, if I let you pay for everything, then I belong to you. I become a dependent variable in your life. I've spent 3 years being entirely at the mercy of landlords, managers, and debt collectors. I won't do it again." Matteo's jaw tightened. The light turned green. He accelerated smoothly. "You think I view you the same way a landlord does? I think you are a man used to owning everything you touch," Tessa said brutally. She turned to look at his profile. The sharp lines of his face were illuminated by the dashboard console. "You bought my time. I gave you my expertise. It's a transaction. I need to keep it a transaction, Matteo." He pulled the heavy vehicle over to the curb a block away from her apartment building. He put it in park, but left the engine running. He unbuckled his seatbelt and turned fully toward her. The space between them in the dark cabin suddenly felt suffocatingly small. If this were just a transaction, Matteo said, his voice a low rumble in his chest, "I wouldn't be driving you home. I wouldn't care that you tape your shoes. I wouldn't have spent the last 4 weeks finding excuses to keep you in my office long after the translations were done." Tessa's breath hitched. She stared into his dark eyes. There was no mockery there, no cold calculation, just a heavy, exhausting vulnerability that mirrored her own. "Matteo, you aren't a piece of furniture." "Tessa," he said softly, repeating the unspoken truth of her life as a waitress. "You are the smartest person in any room you walk into. You look at me and you don't see the money. You don't see the fear. You just see a man with terrible grammar, A small broken laugh escaped her throat. Matteo reached across the console. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He opened his hand, palm up, resting it on the center console. An invitation, not a command. Tessa looked at his hand. The knuckles were calloused. There was a faint, jagged scar running across the back of his thumb. The hand of a man who built his life on violence offering her peace. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached out. She placed her fingers against his palm. Matteo's fingers curled around hers, warm and solid. He didn't pull her closer. He just held her hand, anchoring her in the dark. "I don't want to own you, Tessa," he whispered into the quiet hum of the engine. "I want you to stand next to me. I want you to be the voice I listen to when the rest of the world is screaming." Tessa squeezed his hand. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, hot and unbidden. She didn't wipe it away. "I have a shift tomorrow at 4, she whispered. Matteo smiled, a slow, gentle curve in the shadows. "Then I'll pick you up at 3:30. Don't wear the polyester." The Friday dinner rush was brutal. The air conditioning was failing again, and the kitchen was a humid swamp of burning grease and shouting line cooks. Tessa stood at the wait station. She wasn't carrying a tray. She wasn't holding a polishing cloth. She was just standing there watching the chaos. David came storming out of the back office, his tie loosened, his face flushed purple. "Tessa Table 9 has been waiting for their drinks for 10 minutes. What are you doing, Uvetsha?" Tessa looked at David. She really looked at him. She saw a man who yelled at minimum wage workers because it was the only power he had in a world that mostly ignored him. She used to fear him. Now she just felt a profound, overwhelming pity. She reached behind her back and unfastened the strings of her black apron. David stopped screaming. His mouth hung open. "What are you doing?" Tessa folded the apron neatly. She placed it on the counter next to the espresso machine. "I'm resigning, David," Tessa said smoothly. "You can't resign on a Friday night. I'll blacklist you. You'll never work in this city again." Jenna, who was clutching a stack of menus nearby, gasped. Tessa reached into her pocket. She pulled out a thick envelope and slid it across the counter toward Jenna. "That's for your car payment," Tessa said, looking at her friend. "And next month's rent. Quit this place, Jen. You're better than this." Jenna stared at the envelope, her eyes welling with tears. David slammed his hand on the counter. "You walk out that door, you don't get your last paycheck. I'll report you for..." "For what, David?" Tessa interrupted. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried a sudden chilling authority that made David step back. It was the cadence of a boardroom, the tone of a woman who destroyed Swiss bankers for sport. "If you withhold my pay, I will have my new employer's legal team audit your labor practices for the last 5 years. I know about the shaved hours. I know about the tip pooling violations. Give me my check or lose the restaurant." "Your choice." David blanched. All the blood drained from his face. He looked at the neatly folded apron, then at Tessa, suddenly realizing the girl standing in front of him was entirely untouchable. Tessa didn't wait for his answer. She turned and walked out of the kitchen. She pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room for the last time. The air was cool. The jazz music played softly. And there, waiting by the front doors, was Matteo. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black overcoat. Frank was standing outside on the sidewalk, holding an umbrella against the drizzle. Matteo stood inside the foyer, completely ignoring the hostess. His dark eyes locked on the kitchen doors. When he saw her, the dangerous, guarded mask he wore for the world fractured. He smiled. Tessa walked across the dining room floor. The heavy, squeaking rubber soles of her work shoes felt lighter with every step. She stopped in front of him. "You're early," she noted. "I don't like waiting," Matteo replied. He held out his arm. Tessa looked at the expensive fabric of his coat. She thought about the money, the danger, and the terrifying world he lived in. She thought about the language of power and how for the first time in her life she was fluent in it. She reached out and looped her arm through his. Andiamo, Tessa said softly, her Florentine accent wrapping around the word like silk. Let's go. Matteo looked down at her. He pulled her slightly closer, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm. Da voi, he replied, his grammar perfectly flawless. Wherever you want. They walked out the heavy mahogany doors together, stepping into the rain, the cinder block man holding the umbrella over them both. The restaurant hummed on behind them, full of wealthy people who had no idea they had just watched the most powerful man in the city surrender entirely to the girl who used to pour their water. From a taped-up shoe to taking down international bankers, Tessa proved that true power isn't about how loud you yell, but how well you understand the game. She didn't just survive Matteo's dark world. She corrected its grammar and claimed her place right beside him. If you loved this intensely grounded, zero-cliché mafia romance, where the brilliant waitress actually puts the billionaire boss in his place, you have to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a truly fierce female lead. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible audio dramas. See you next time.